war often turns on inventions no larger than a coin. In 1941, while Britain burned and its skies thundered with the roar of dogfights, one woman with a brass washer no wider than her thumbnail changed the course of air combat. Beatrice Tilly Schilling did not fire guns or fly missions. She fought with mathematics, machining oil, and the quiet fury of knowing that British pilots were dying not because they were outmatched, but because their engines were. At 7:42 a.m. on March 14, 1941, the runway at RAF Kenley was slick with dew. Mechanics shouted, propellers snarled, and above the noise stood a slender woman in a brown leather coat watching a Hurricane fighter roll toward takeoff. The pilot inside, Squadron Leader Davies, was 24, battle-tested, and twice lucky to have survived engine failures during combat dives. Today, he would test something that might keep him alive, though he didn't know it yet. 6 years earlier, Schilling had joined the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, one of the few female engineers in Britain's military research system. For months, she had lived with one unsolved problem. Why the Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, powering every Spitfire and Hurricane, kept dying the moment a pilot pushed the stick forward to dive. The issue was mechanical and merciless. The Merlin used an SU float-type carburetor designed for steady flight. Under -G, the inverted acceleration produced when a plane suddenly pitched nose down, the fuel in the float chamber surged upward, drowning the jet and starving the cylinders. The engine cut out for 1.5 seconds. In combat, that brief silence was fatal. German Messerschmitt Bf 109s, using direct fuel injection, could dive, roll, and climb without a cough. They exploited the flaw ruthlessly, looping over stalled Hurricanes to kill the trapped pilots before the Merlins coughed back to life. British command knew the statistics. Since the Battle of Britain began, hundreds of aircraft had been lost not to bullets, but to gravity and gasoline. Rolls-Royce engineers were already developing a pressure carburetor that would solve the problem permanently, but it was 2 years away. The war would not wait. Schilling refused to accept that British pilots must die while bureaucrats designed a new engine. She understood engines in her bones. At 14, she had bought a battered Norton motorcycle, taken it apart piece by piece, and reassembled it until it purred. At 25, she raced that same bike around the Brooklyn circuit at over 100 miles per hour, earning the British Motorcycle Racing Club's Gold Star, a distinction only 3 women ever achieved. Racing taught her what textbooks did not: how machinery behaves at the edge of failure, how fuel sloshes under violent motion, how a spark can mean victory or death. When she joined Farnborough's engine department in 1939, she brought that intuition into the laboratory. For 11 months she tested, measured, and argued. The men around her, some brilliant, some dismissive, suggested complicated valves or pumps. Schilling looked for something simpler. Early in 1941, she had a revelation as elegant as it was audacious. The carburetor failed because fuel could surge without resistance. Therefore, the answer was not to redesign the system, but to restrain it. Insert a thin brass washer into the fuel line with a single calibrated hole at its center, 0.04 inches across. The hole would limit the maximum flow of fuel during -G, preventing flooding while still allowing full power at normal throttle. Too large, and it would fail. Too small, and the engine would starve. After 17 prototypes, she found the precise dimensions. Bench tests at Farnborough proved the idea worked. The fuel mixture stayed steady even when the engine was inverted. But laboratory success was meaningless without proof in combat. Regulations forbade unauthorized modifications to operational aircraft. If the device failed and a pilot died, the blame would fall squarely on her. Schilling decided to act first and apologize later. She packed 6 of her handmade restrictors into a leather satchel, mounted her motorcycle, and rode through the cold morning to Kenley Airfield. There she found Sergeant William Cooper, a ground crew mechanic who had buried too many friends. She showed him the small disc of brass. He stared, understood, and wordlessly reached for his tools. They worked in secret beside the waiting Hurricane. Cooper disconnected the fuel line between pump and carburetor, slid the washer into place, and sealed it with a quick weld. The modification was invisible, a ghost hidden within the engine. At 8 a.m., the pilot taxied out. Schilling stood at the edge of the tarmac, heart pounding. The Merlin roared, the plane lifted, and she watched through binoculars as it climbed into the bright March sky. If her calculations were wrong, the pilot would die within the hour. 40 minutes passed. No radio calls. An hour. Then the controller's voice crackled through the static. 3 Hurricanes returning, 2 minutes out. Schilling raised her binoculars and saw 3 black specks approaching from the channel, wings glinting in the sun. All 3 intact. When Davies rolled to a stop and climbed from his cockpit, there was an unfamiliar smile on his face. "Best the Merlins ever run," he said. "Dove on 2 Messerschmitts. Engine never missed a beat." He described the moment in detail. A steep 400-mile-per-hour dive, negative G pinning him against his straps, yet the power stayed smooth. He had fired, hit 1 enemy plane, and lived. For the first time in 11 months, a British pilot had completed a dive attack without his engine cutting out. Word spread as fast as the Hurricanes could fly. By evening, Cooper had installed the device in 4 more aircraft. Over the next 3 days, 5 combat patrols reported 0 engine failures and multiple successful kills. Pilots who had learned to fear the dive now trusted it again. The brass washer, costing less than 50 cents in materials, was rewriting the tactics of air combat. But 6 washers were not enough to save the RAF. To equip every squadron in fighter command, Schilling needed thousands. She needed authorization, funding, and a production line. Yet she also knew that red tape could strangle ideas as surely as gravity killed engines. Taking the data from Kenley, she drove back to Farnborough and drafted a report detailing her results. The evidence was irrefutable. The restrictor eliminated flooding under negative G, could be installed in minutes, and required no new parts. Within 4 days, the Air Ministry approved mass production. Rolls-Royce received the contract. Even as machines began to turn, Schilling refused to sit behind a desk. She formed a small traveling team, 3 engineers and 2 civilian mechanics, and prepared to tour every fighter station in southern England. Her job was to supervise installations personally, ensuring each weld met her exact standards. Pilots trusted her because she spoke their language. She could recite manifold pressure ratios as easily as recounting races at Brooklands. When they doubted that such a tiny disk could save lives, she explained the physics calmly. "It's not magic, it's mathematics." By the end of March, the first shipment of 600 restrictors arrived. Schilling loaded her Norton motorcycle with tools and parts, then rode north toward Biggin Hill, the busiest air base in No. 11 Group. The commander, Group Captain Grace, met her at the gate. He had lost 7 pilots in 2 months to the carburetor problem and greeted her like a surgeon arriving at a field hospital. Ground crews worked in rotating shifts, 4 aircraft at a time. Each installation took 12 minutes. Disconnect, insert, weld, reconnect, test. Schilling inspected every joint herself. She rejected 3 imperfect washers, adjusted the calibration, and moved on. Pilots gathered around to watch, curiosity mixing with superstition. Flight Lieutenant James Lacey, an engineering graduate from Cambridge, studied the disc and whispered, "Brilliant simplicity." Within 48 hours, all 53 fighters at Biggin Hill were equipped. Next came Hornchurch, North Weald, Tangmere, station after station. The pattern repeated, long days, sleepless nights, and the steady rhythm of engines that no longer failed. Reports from combat units were ecstatic. Diving attacks succeeded, kill ratios improved, and morale soared. The pilots christened the device with the irreverent humor of wartime Britain. Miss Schilling's Orifice. The nickname made her blush, then laugh. If crude jokes helped men remember a life-saving part, she would wear the title proudly. By mid-April 1941, over 2,000 Merlin engines had the washer installed. Engine failure rates in dives plummeted from nearly 40% to less than 0.5%. Fighter Command's kill-to-loss ratio tripled within a month. German intelligence soon noticed. Reports from the Luftwaffe's analysis units complained that British fighters were suddenly capable of sustained negative G maneuvers. "The enemy no longer breaks off pursuit," one pilot wrote. The technical edge of the Messerschmitt was gone. By late April 1941, the restrictor had become standard issue. Every Hurricane, every Spitfire, every fighter trainer in Britain's inventory carried a small brass washer hidden in its fuel line, a silent guardian born from a single woman's determination. Pilots who once dreaded negative G dives now used them as offensive maneuvers. Enemy aces who relied on the Merlin's momentary stall to escape suddenly found British guns still roaring behind them. For the first time since 1940, the RAF fought on equal mechanical footing with the Luftwaffe. Factories at Rolls-Royce and the Royal Aircraft Establishment ran day and night, producing hundreds of restrictors a week. Schilling oversaw every production batch, checking tolerances down to 1,000th of an inch. The war demanded speed, but she refused to compromise precision. Each washer had to hold its shape under vibration, temperature, and the violent surges of combat flight. She knew a flawed weld or misshapen hole could cost a pilot his life. Her colleagues joke that she was the only engineer in the Air Ministry who could frighten both generals and machinists. The results were measurable, and in war, statistics mattered as much as courage. Fighter Command tracked every sortie, every loss, every successful dive. Before March 1941, reports listed engine cutout as a cause in almost 4 out of every 10 failed engagements. By May, that entry had nearly vanished. Pilots now returned from missions with bullet holes in wings but smiles on faces. They could chase Messerschmitts through loops, dives, and rolls without fear that their engines would betray them. In pilots' mess halls across England, Miss Schilling's orifice became legend. She received letters written in grease-stained handwriting, "I owe you a pint and my life. Your washer saved my wingman. Tell Rolls-Royce to build you a statue." But Schilling did not seek statues. She preferred machines to ceremonies. Her mind was already turning to new problems: fuel icing in the Arctic, high-altitude mixture control, supercharger efficiency. Yet, even as she moved on, the restrictor continued its quiet service. Rolls-Royce's pressure carburetor, the long-term fix, was still 2 years away. Until then, her 50-cent washer would keep the RAF in the air. The Ministry of Aircraft Production formally recognized the restrictor as a war-winning modification. Newspapers never mentioned her name. Wartime censorship and male-dominated hierarchies saw to that. But within the service, she became something close to myth. Ground crews told new recruits about the woman from Farnborough who rode her motorcycle through blackout nights, carrying salvation in her satchel. Pilots toasted her in absentia before takeoff. She remained unimpressed by praise. It was just a matter of physics, she said, and doing it before anyone else died. Through 1942 and 1943, the restrictor spread far beyond Fighter Command. Coastal Command fitted it to bow fighters that hunted submarines over the North Sea. Training units used it in 2-seat Harvards. Even the Fleet Air Arm requested it for carrier-based Fulmars and Sea Hurricanes. Every installation used the same simple procedure: cut the line, insert the washer, weld, test. The device was so easy to fit that some squadrons fabricated their own copies in base workshops when the supply shipments lagged. The tactical consequences were profound. Before the restrictor, British fighters had avoided inverted maneuvers, favoring climbing turns that cost altitude and speed. Afterward, pilots could dive aggressively, sustaining pursuit without power loss. German analysts reported that RAF fighters had adopted uncharacteristically offensive tactics. Kill ratios reflected the shift. By late 1941, British units over occupied France destroyed 3 enemy fighters for every one lost. Veteran aces who had once cursed their Merlins now praised them as indestructible. In the broader context of the air war, Schilling's invention came at a critical moment. The Luftwaffe was redirecting its resources toward the Eastern Front, but raids over Britain and the Channel coast continued. The RAF needed to hold the line until American-built aircraft and long-range bombers could join the fight. Every pilot saved by her washer represented not just one life, but months of training, irreplaceable experience, and morale for a nation that still faced nightly bombings. By 1943, Rolls-Royce finally completed development of the pressure carburetor, a full redesign that used a sealed diaphragm system to maintain constant fuel pressure regardless of gravity. The new units offered perfect performance under any flight condition. They began replacing Schilling's washers on new production engines, but the old restrictors refused to vanish. Many ground crews kept them installed as backups, superstition wrapped in engineering. Pilots who trusted the brass disc were reluctant to remove it. "If it saved me once, it stays," one squadron leader declared. Schilling herself had already turned to colder climates. The RAF was preparing to send Spitfires to aid the Soviet Union through the Arctic convoys. Those aircraft faced freezing temperatures that turned oil to sludge and fuel to jelly. The same woman who solved negative G flooding now tackled cold start failures. She devised a preheating system using portable fuel burners and modified oil mixtures, allowing engines to start in temperatures below -40 degrees. Once again, simple principles applied with ruthless logic kept planes flying. Her husband, George Naylor, flew Lancasters with Bomber Command. He survived 31 missions over Germany, a statistical miracle in a branch where half of all airmen never came home. They seldom spoke about their work. She knew his odds. He knew her burdens. When the war ended in 1945, they both returned to Farnborough, each carrying ghosts they would never name. Peace did not end her curiosity. She worked on high-altitude fuel systems, runway friction studies, and later on jet aircraft braking research. The Royal Aircraft Establishment trusted her with projects that demanded both intuition and discipline. She wrote technical papers dense with equations but leavened by field wisdom. Younger engineers, especially women, sought her out as mentor and model. She told them to ignore anyone who doubted their place. "Engines don't care who fixes them," she said. In 1948, the British government finally acknowledged her contribution. King George VI appointed her Officer of the Order of the British Empire for services to aviation engineering. At Buckingham Palace, she accepted the medal, posed for a photograph, and the next morning returned to her lab as if nothing had happened. Titles were fine, but machines still misbehaved and someone had to tame them. She remained at the Royal Aircraft Establishment for 20 more years. She contributed to early missile projects, studied water spray effects on jet runways, and even designed a streamlined bobsled for the RAF sports team, a curious but fitting intersection of speed, physics, and national pride. Yet no invention ever eclipsed the humble washer of 1941. When she retired in 1969, colleagues gathered to present her with a commemorative plaque engraved with the words, "To the woman who kept the Merlins running." She thanked them politely, then rode home on the same Norton motorcycle she had bought at 14. Its engine rebuilt countless times, its sound still sharp as memory. She died in 1990 at the age of 81. Newspapers described her as the engineer who saved the Spitfire. The obituaries focused, as they always did, on the brass disc, 50 cents of metal that changed a war. But the real story was not the washer itself. It was the mindset behind it. The refusal to accept that perfection must precede action, the courage to implement a field solution under fire, the faith that reason and resolve could overcome hierarchy. Schilling's orifice embodied the essence of wartime engineering: simple, immediate, effective. It reminded every designer who came after that innovation is often not about inventing something new, but about seeing the old from a different angle. Decades later, students at engineering schools around the world study her work. In classrooms from Cambridge to Caltech, instructors hold up a photograph of that small brass ring and ask a question that transcends time. How much is a human life worth in metal and thought? The answer, written in every pilot's survival log, is 50 cents and one woman's persistence. Her legacy endures not in monuments but in method. She demonstrated that precision and empathy can coexist, that the same hands that polish a piece of brass can also save a generation. In the age of digital avionics and autonomous drones, her story continues to resonate because it speaks to a universal truth of engineering: that progress depends on people willing to act when systems fail, willing to risk careers to save strangers. In the end, Beatrice Tilly Schilling did not merely solve a carburetor problem. She restored confidence to an Air Force, balance to a war, and faith to a profession that too often overlooks quiet heroes. The next time a Spitfire gleams in a museum or climbs into a summer sky during an air show, its Merlin engine still sings a note of gratitude to the woman who once stood on a cold runway with a satchel full of brass washers, watching the future take off.